Hello everyone and welcome to this new video. Today I'm talking to Lee from Whitway Studios. Lee, can you introduce yourself?
Hi there, yeah, my name is Lee, and as you said, I'm the founder of Whitway Studios. We're a small indie virtual reality game development house based in Peterborough in the UK, and it's really good to talk to you.
In a nutshell, what kind of game are we talking about today?
So we have a game coming out, which I think will be on the footage that's playing behind this, called People Cubed. And cubed is spelt a little bit funny for anyone who wants to look for that. That's cu3ed. The game itself is an action puzzle game, as I mentioned before, in virtual reality. And it's got a big dollop of probably best described as British humor, kind of drizzled over the top of it. So it doesn't take itself too seriously. The characters that you'll play with in the game will constantly break the fourth wall, or I'm not sure if it's called the fourth wall in virtual reality. It might be the fifth wall. Whichever it is that it's doing, the characters are very self-aware, and they will laugh at their own expense. And the principle behind the game is some unique mechanics that we've developed, which are kind of like if you were to imagine doing stepping stones, but in 3 dimensions as opposed to 2 dimensions, and moving those stepping stones in order to allow you to get across a space. And then if you also add the slight weird fact that those stepping stones are alive and they are your friends in this game and they're the characters that you're interacting with. So it's kind of a tough one to describe, but again, hopefully with the video playing in the background, that gives you some idea of what's going on in the game there.
Why did you choose to make a game like this?
I don't think it was a case of choosing to make the game. It was more a case of playing around in the Unity game engine, and just playing around with various different projects occasionally, not with any serious intent of making anything that would be published, and actually having some friends around at a dinner party, and it being suggested that, hey, why don't we play on that thing that you've been locked away in your office working on for the last couple of weeks? And I was it's not ready yet. It's not that impressive. It's not fun yet. All I was doing was playing around with just some weird mechanics in Unity with a VR headset. Anyway, we decided to give it a go, and before I knew it, I was really quite surprised to see this group of people that were over for a dinner party playing this very early version and prototype of the game People Cubed, and having a hell of a lot of fun doing it. They were kind of racing to get across the level against each other and taking it in turns to come out and then watch the other person try to beat their time, and dodging and ducking to avoid these sort of very basic enemies that I developed at this early stage in the process. And it kind of dawned on me, and the other guys that were there, just how much fun they were having with this really basic but weird mechanic. And I sort of looked around and I couldn't see that there was another game that had stumbled across these mechanics, and there certainly wasn't another game that involved this kind of process of playing. And so I started working on it, and added a few more levels, had some different people around to have a play, worked on a few more levels, had some more different people to come around to play. And before we knew it, it kind of got to sort of halfway through the year, and People Cubed had a title, and we were thinking about founding a company to publish it. It's kind of snowballed from there. So it never was the case that we sort of set out and went, do you know what? I'm slightly crazy, so I've got this weird idea and a weird dream of these people that have been turned into cubes, and you have to guide them up this big purple tower. Because I think you'd have to be crazy to come up with that. But it did kind of evolve from a very basic playing around project on Unity.
You said we, so do you work with more people within your studio?
Yeah, I mean, the game is primarily made by myself. But if you've played on the game, or if you see any footage of the game, you'll notice there's other people's voices in there. And those are a very close group of friends of mine who've been heavily involved in the testing. They've been involved in recording videos of them playing footage. My wife has been heavily involved in voicing one of the characters, for example. And then because we've tried to build it like a sustainable business for future, she's been heavily involved in that as well. So whilst the game is very much my baby, there's quite a few people that have contributed to it that, the game would not be anywhere near the state it is if it wasn't for those people. And one of the other big contributions I should say as well, is the music, which has been one of the things that with the preview copies we've had sent out to people in the demo, people have really praised the music. That was done entirely by a third party, and they've done an absolutely fantastic job. I have no sense of music. I have no sense of style of any sort. And so having somebody provide the programming and some great music was really, really good. So yeah, the game's my baby, but I do keep referring to we because there is more than just me involved in it.
Did the game become what you literally planned it to become before the start of development?
Well, because we didn't really have a big plan at the start of development, it's definitely not what was planned, in a way. But I will say that we did stop and sit down at one point in probably the spring of this year and say, okay, if this is going to be a game, one that other people are entertained by, one that people enjoy, what do we need to have in it? And so developed a bit of a storyline for it and developed some extra features and stuff that haven't quite made it into the final version. But then through the testing period, we found that some of these features, we had this whole mechanic where if the cubes felt happy or sad, they would change color. But it felt like the game was taking itself too seriously. Similarly, we had this sort of storyline mapped out with character development, and we might even kill one of the characters off and this kind of thing. And again, playing through it with that story attached to it, it didn't feel genuine. It felt like we were taking ourselves too seriously. And bottom line, this is an indie game with some funny characters having fun, and to have these cubes who look quite funny with cartoon faces go on an emotional journey, it didn't make sense. So we did really pull back on the story and really focus on making it humorous rather than making take itself seriously. And I think similar to a lot of other indie games, there are features that you plan at the beginning and you think, oh, it would be cool if it would be cool if we did this. And then when you actually get to do it, either it takes an insane amount of time to program and it doesn't actually add that much value, or you unfortunately put a feature in and it completely breaks one of the level structures or something like that. And I'm exaggerating it slightly, but it gives you the ability to fly instantly from one side of the level to the other. And okay, unforeseen consequence there. So yeah, there's been stuff we've had to step back on that we kind of planned in when we thought it would turn into a real game. But ultimately, it's similar enough to the very first prototype that it's definitely recognizable. It's just been put into a position now where it flows better, it makes more sense, and all of the humorous stuff that we've added really adds something to the game that, as I mentioned, breaks the fourth wall. It makes you laugh as you play the game, and that's been really good.
What inspired you to become an indie game developer?
Well, I have been on and off involved in coding for some time in my life. But when I picked up about this time last year a virtual reality headset, I put it on my head and I was just absolutely blown away by the idea that any world I could imagine, I could then create and I could be in it. And if people out there have only tried like the low end entry level VR where you're basically holding a phone in front of your head like a Google Cardboard or something, then you kind of don't know what you're missing, because the really high end VR stuff that is out there now is absolutely fantastic. It's epic. You can genuinely feel like you're in another world. And I think there was a moment just in one of the Steam menu pages in VR where you can just lay down on your floor and there's beautiful blue sky above you with seagulls flying around, and it's all virtual reality, but it's it's real enough to kid your own mind into thinking that you're there. And with that ability in mind, and also watching my wife step into VR and see her jaw drop. She's not a computer game person, she's not a computer person or a techie person, but just to see an average member of the public get put into this piece of technology and to see them be blown away by it as well, that's when it really twigged to me, hey, okay, I think you need to get back on the coding. I think you need to get back to learning what you're doing again here, and maybe have a play around it and try and make something. And that's what started me back on the journey to refresh, I should say, and learn how to, I wouldn't say at the time I was thinking of making games, but certainly how to make computer applications. And then from sort of this time last year through to now, that journey's traveled quite quick to producing a game.
Is this your first game?
It's the first game that will be published, but as I mentioned, there were quite a few random projects along the way. One that I spent an inordinate amount of time on was recreating one-to-one an entirely virtual version of the kitchen dining room, which is where my old VR setup was in the house that we lived in before I moved. So you'd be sat there, you'd put the VR headset on, and you would think you were still in exactly the same place with the VR headset on. And it started getting a little bit silly. I added a giant dinosaur that would break one of the windows, and some other creatures wandering around outside in a forest that didn't exist outside of our house. Going back before that, there was just some silly virtual worlds for me and friends to play in. And then going back way before then, I think the last kind of games that I made, but again never published, were back in things like the ZX Spectrum, a very old piece of kit. And I used to do some very basic and machine code programming back on there, and I used to make it wouldn't have been called such a thing back then, but now we'd know it as a chatbot. So something that you type and you have conversations with. I remember making very basic versions of those when I was much, much younger, for my younger sister to learn how to type on a keyboard. So I've been making programs and I've been making things, but never published one, never published an app, not until this point.
For what platforms do you intend to release this game?
So on the 2nd of November this year, 2018, it will be coming out on Steam, and that means it will be compatible with the Steam VR headsets. So the most common one there is HTC Vive, but obviously the Pimax is coming out at the moment, which is an exciting VR development. So if anyone has one of those, it will work on that too. It's also compatible with Oculus Rift as well. And on the 2nd November, it will also be compatible with the Windows mixed reality headsets as well. In fact, it runs very well on them. I've done quite a bit of testing with that particular type of headset. That's the 2nd of November. The game, as you can probably see from the video, has been designed to have as lower overhead as possible for virtual reality. And the reason we've done that is we've got one eye on the standalone VR headsets that are out there. So be it the new Oculus Quest that's been announced for Q1 next year, or be it the existing headsets like the HTC Vive Focus. So after the game's been released on the 2nd of November, we're going to be going for a period of porting it across to as many of the standalone VR headsets as possible. Some of them we may struggle to fit it onto because some of them are quite underpowered. But for the most part, I think we're going to get it across to most of them. Definitely things like the Oculus Quest, that's definitely capable of running this game. So we're going to be trying to port it onto those as well. And then also we plan to port this over to PlayStation VR as well. We're making the first steps into that process. We've been doing the paperwork for a while, but we've been making the first steps into doing the hardware side of that over the next few weeks as well.
What do you think is your best attitude in life?
So I think the obvious answer for an indie developer is being persistent. But part of the problem with being persistent is you've got to make sure you're focusing on the right things. And I'm not originally an indie game developer. I've had a career in business management for many years now, a bit too long now I think about it. But working in other industries and by working team managing people and that kind of thing, you learn that one of the most valuable skills that you can have and traits you can have is the ability to seek out and ask for and accept critical feedback. And I think that actually is really important to an indie developer as well, is that ability to say, hey, look at my precious baby project game. Please, general public, random people that don't like me so much, please play on this, please break it, please tell me what will make it work and what will make it better, and take that feedback and then be persistent with that feedback and make sure that you're working on the right things, because it's all very well being the hardest person in the world. If you're not working on the right stuff, then you could end up producing something that's not so good. And that's helped me in my career, is that 360-degree feedback type way of working. And I think it's helped with this game development process as well, because we've had a huge amount of people from a huge sort of different backgrounds in life, right the way through to very young teenagers, through to grandparents trying out on the game. And we've kind of developed a system in the game to allow people with very, very low skill in virtual reality games to enjoy it at the same time as people who are very experienced and are used to really high-paced shooters. And that's come through this feedback, and that's come through this seeking out of critical feedback. So I think that's probably one of the better traits, and that's something that's certainly helped the game development as well.
For how long have you been working on this project?
So the prototype, which was basically an electronic version of the Grand Canyon, and some crazy colored cubes that were green and blue and purple that had some very rough faces drawn on the front of them, that was done over the Easter weekend of this year. And it was literally a case of being locked in a room for Easter Friday, that's not the thing, Good Friday, all of the weekend and through to Easter Monday, and then sort of showing it to a couple of people on the Monday. It didn't have a name back then, it was just a rough prototype thing, just something I was playing with, something I decided to set that weekend apart for and to start working on that. And from then onwards up until now, that's kind of been the development process. So I think in the grand scheme of game development, not that long, but I think the amount of hours that have been sunk into it is probably more than it would seem in between early March of this year and October of now.
What was your day-to-day process for making this game?
So my full-time job is not creating games. So my day-to-day process usually starts by getting up and going to my day job, and then coming home and spending just as many hours working on making the game as well. So it's a bit like having two jobs, which is great fun. But when it comes to actually producing the game, it's hard. I think one of the beautiful things about being an indie developer is you don't get too pigeonholed and you don't get too rigid in terms of what you're doing. So one day you could be animating an enemy, or another day you could be recording audio with a group of people, and another day you could be editing that audio, or you could be doing the coding or whatever it might be. And because part of my sort of training in my career has been project management, it was very easy to sit there and say, right, this is what I need to be working on this day, and it will be completely different from the thing I'm working on the next day, and they may not even obviously link together, but they end up coming together in the end. So I wouldn't say there's been a very typical day in the life of developing the game, but it's in general it was a lot of asset creation up front and a lot of programming up front, followed by fixing the dodgy programming that I did up front, followed by then building the game as a result of that. So that's kind of a rough idea, if that makes sense.
Will that be the same for potential future games you make?
Well, we've got a long list of projects in the pipeline, some of them completely different to what People Cubed has ended up becoming. And I'm actually quite excited to start working on them because I've been working on this one for what feels like a while now. But in terms of what we'll do differently with the process, there is I've learned quite a lot about the process of making a game over the last year. And every week, to be honest, I learn something new, and every week I learn a more efficient way of doing things. So I think the next time it will be quite structured again in terms of project management. So that's, that will be very similar. And there probably will be a certain amount more modularity that is built into the programming. So that will stop me having to repeat myself when it comes to doing a lot of the coding and stuff. But I think the process will be fairly similar, and I kind of want it to stay that way as well. I don't want it to become too fixed. I don't want to become a graphic artist and exclusively a graphic artist, because number one, I'm nowhere near good enough to do that, and number two, I don't want to be doing exactly the same thing every single day. I quite like the variety.
What were the biggest inspiration for making this game?
So as I kind of mentioned, I don't think there was a moment of sitting down and going, right, I'm slightly crazy, so I've come up with this idea for floating blocks that talk. That there wasn't a dream or some hallucination that inspired it. But at the same time, I have had people who have played the game sort of remind me of how similar some of the humor is to certain games that have been produced in the past, certain games that I really liked, and perhaps there was an unconscious influence on it from there. So things like from back in the N64 days, Conker's Bad Fur Day, that was one of my favorite games from back then. And certain parts of the humor and certain characters have been compared to things from games like that. And if I look a bit more sort of the modern era, especially from a virtual reality point of view, it's becoming quite a genre almost for the comedy VR game, because you feel one of two ways when you're in virtual reality. Either you're kicking robots' asses and you're shooting stuff and you're just feeling like a badass, or you're very conscious of the fact that you're stood in the middle of a room waving your arms about, and what everyone else can see is not what you can see. And I think there's a good sort of laughing at yourself genre almost developing within VR. So if I look at games like Job Simulator or Vacation Simulator or Rick and Morty, and there's a good set of comic games that take advantage of the physical humor. And People Cubed is of that ilk as well. It very much will force you to laugh at yourself, laugh at the other characters, and just have a good time, and have a physically good time as well. Physical humor is quite important.
What makes this game different from others?
So what the game is developed around is these core mechanics that I described very badly earlier on as stepping stones. And it's kind of a very physical way of using yourself and the other characters to solve puzzles. So, you're picking up and you're physically dragging and dropping your friends. I'm doing it with my hands, which obviously you can't see right now. That's very useful. So, you're directing your teammates to move around the level and to use them to flip switches and to duck and to dodge obstacles that are being thrown at you or shot at you, or maybe you're sneaking through a laser grid. But the unique part is that because you can't physically move yourself, there's no you can't use a thumbstick to move yourself around in this physical world. All you can do is teleport onto your friends' heads. What that forces you to do is think very strategically about where you're going to position them. And is it safe to position them there? And is it safe for you to stand on their heads once you've positioned them? And once you've positioned them there, will you then be able to reach back to your other friend and be able to direct them to move to the other place? So this whole unique mechanic that we've developed in People Cubed, that's quite special. That's something that, as far as I know, has not been done before. It only really works in virtual reality, and I'm sure someone with a lot more money will come along and do it 10 times better than we've done. But at the same time, we're quite proud to have developed it by ourselves.
What do you think is the most interesting part of the game?
The bit that I find the most enjoyable, bearing in mind I've spent thousands of hours playing my own game now at this point, testing, and watching other people play it as well, is probably the middle to last levels, which is actually a bit of a shame. I think that the game is at its best when you kind of get to the halfway point and you've learned all the core mechanics, you know the best way to move around the level, and then we're really able to throw some good challenges at the players. We had a demo that was released and was available to download up until yesterday, actually, where we pulled the demo off of the internet because it wasn't really representative of the finished product now. But we had a demo which had 5 levels, and it was really difficult in those 5 levels for people to learn the mechanics as quickly as we would want them to really enjoy the game. And so we were kind of forced to give some much more basic levels out in the demo. People still enjoyed it from what I could see, and we had some very good feedback on the demo. But I think the most interesting part of the game is when you've got those skills kind of built into your muscle memory, and you're able to actually move cubes in the game and know, okay, there's a switch over there, I'm probably going to have to do something with a switch, whereas when you first start the game, I don't know what a switch looks like. Well, there's a bright yellow and black door. Okay, what do I do with a yellow and black door? Do I go around it? Do I go under it? Or do I have to figure out a puzzle to open it? Once you know, generally speaking, what the rules are in the game, that's when we can really throw some fascinating stuff, and also some big surprises too. So, there's quite a few levels where they will open up later in the game, and you think you understand what you're going to have to do to get to the other side of the level, but actually we throw something completely outside of the box, no pun intended, at the player, and they, without spoiling it too much, they have to think completely differently about how to solve what they think is a simple problem. So I still get, although the time pressure is on now and I need to stop playing on my game and actually start publishing it, I still get quite a big thrill from some of the later levels in the game where I'm sat there going, oh, so close to the finish. Oh no, screwed up. I have to start again. And if I'm still enjoying it after spending as many hours as I have done on it, then I'm sure the general public will as well.
You mentioned before that you are using Unity. Why did you decide to use Unity?
I'm a big Unity fan now, having used it for the last year. And I know some people critical of Unity, but to be honest, especially if I look at the 2018 version, which I'm not using, by the way, I'm having to stick with one of the 2017 versions because I'm too scared to upgrade in the middle of producing a project. But especially if I look at the new 2018 version, it's just such a robust tool for all ends of the market. Whether you're developing a smartphone application for an extremely underpowered old version of the iPhone, like the iPhone 5 or something like that, or if you're developing for, the latest, greatest RTX 2080 Ti inspired shooter game, it's got the graphics and it's got the economy of code in order to allow you to produce really at both ends of the spectrum. And virtual reality sits somewhere in the middle. And beyond how flexible it is as a tool in that respect, the SDKs that are available for virtual reality to plug straight into Unity are really, really good. And probably the Unreal Engine is a close second in terms of VR integration. But just based on the amount of experience I've now got with Unity and plugging various different SDKs straight into it, and although nothing is quite as simple as drag and drop, it's probably about as simple in game development terms as you're going to get to dragging and dropping. Hey, here we go. Just plug the VR headset in and Unity will work straight away. Like I say, it's not quite that simple, but it's, from a developer's point of view, it takes a lot of the legwork out. It takes a lot of the hard work out. And then the other reason for me was I tried to learn C++ when I was a teenager, and I was scared off of it because I had a terrible instruction book for it and a terrible compiler that didn't really work on this old Windows 95 machine I think I had at the time. And coming to Unity with C#, which is a much friendlier, in my opinion, language, and also working with things like the functional state machines that you're able to use to do some visual programming in there as well. It was just a great experience. And as well as that, the support. The courses that are available for it are absolutely brilliant, and it's almost too easy to learn how to use it. if that makes sense. It's so accessible, and it's such a powerful expert level tool that you can do almost anything that you can imagine with. And I would really, really hate to move away from it now, having spent so much time with it.
What setbacks did you encounter during the project, and do you feel like you learned anything from them?
The setbacks that I encountered were mainly of my own making. So it would usually be a case of I tried to make sure that we didn't run away with ourselves and create all 40 levels of the game, because it's quite a big game. You know, you're going to be playing this for multiple hours if you want to finish it. And the issue with creating a big game with a team of essentially one person doing the programming for it is that you end up copying and pasting, really, any mistakes that you've made in one level. And they don't necessarily have to be coding mistakes or true errors or mistakes, but they can be little things like just bad direction that you've taken in terms of filling with the mechanics or something like that, or the sound levels, and then you copy and paste that across to everything else. So I tried to restrict, the amount of levels that we did before we had what was absolutely perfect in terms of the core functionality of the game. But even doing that with the best will in the world, because we relied so extensively on people coming in, testing the game and telling us we were wrong about doing things, every piece of feedback, as far as we were able, we've tried to take that on board. And that has meant going back to 48 or however many levels, if you include the tutorial, that there are 48 levels of code, and occasionally having to make dramatic changes to each individual level, which can take quite a lot of time, as you can imagine. And to be honest, that also speaks to my, I'm going to call it naivety, when I started the project, in that I didn't really quite understand how modularly you can build stuff in both Unity, in C#, in the functional state machine type approach. And sort of looking back at it, it will probably, if I'd made a lot of the core mechanics a lot more modular than they ended up being, it would have saved me a lot of time, and none of which are major setbacks, but they certainly have been times that have taken a lot more time. And I suppose the other one that's worth saying was we did a lot of audio recording very early on in the game production process, because I had a lot of the audio equipment around. The problem was it was set up really badly, and you could tell in the demo version that we released in September that this character's audio was recorded early in the process. This character's audio was recorded late in the process. And you could just tell, even in the demo that we put out, that it was obvious that character there, we knew what we were doing a bit more when that one's audio was recorded. And funny enough, one of the characters, he's actually an audio engineer by training, and his character's audio was absolutely perfect. But when we then went back and we listened to some of the other characters we recorded earlier in the process, it just sounded terrible by comparison. So that was one of the obvious things we picked up from the demo feedback was, hey, look, these characters here, you need to redo their audio. And that took a long time for us to redo and then insert back into it. But to be honest, looking at the results now, I'm pleased we did, because it's now been recorded in a much more, I wouldn't say professional, but semi-professional studio. It's a much higher quality, and on top of that, we've managed to make some of the jokes funnier as well, which we wouldn't have got the opportunity to do if we'd not had that setback, if you like.
If you could go back in time, what would you do different?
I would tell myself what the lottery numbers were from last week. No, if I could go back in time, there's not a huge amount I would change about the making the game. I might fix it so that we're due to release it maybe early next year rather than this year, because it really has taken a hell of a lot to get it to the point where we're ready to release now. But now we're there, what's done is done. I don't think we'd change a huge amount about the concept. Perhaps we wouldn't spend so much time doing some of the audio recording up front, as I mentioned beforehand. And I also touched on modularity. That's something that, just from a game design point of view and from a behind the scenes, what you can't see when you're playing the game is that a lot of the mechanics I originally created I did it in a very, as I said, naive kind of way. So it was a case of doing the mechanics from scratch in one level, and then doing them from scratch again in the next level, and then doing them from scratch again in the next level, which meant every single one was slightly different, which was infuriating when I then went to go back in and make subtle changes to every single level. Now, what I've since become a lot better at is just making stuff modular, so I can almost copy and paste an object into a level and go, hey, right, this one's now going to behave in exactly the same way. Whereas I wasn't very good at doing that beforehand. So I probably would go back and give myself a slap in the face, tell myself to make sure I did that. That's as well as giving myself the lottery numbers, that is.
If you can advise a new indie game developer, what will you tell them?
As a fairly new indie game developer, take what I'm about to say with a big pinch of salt, because I don't have a huge amount of experience as an indie game myself. But one of the things I will say is that the indie game world, and from some of the other developers I speak to, it's full of some really, really talented people, and really great. I think the only word is artists, and I don't just mean the people that work on the art. I mean the people that create the games and come up with the concepts for them. There's some really great ideas out there, some really fantastic things. But sometimes I think my observation is some people will go straight into it from the point of view of creating this piece of art, and they won't think about the business that needs to be there behind it. They won't think about feeding themselves, and they won't think about the marketing, and they won't think about the sales. They won't think about the networking and that kind of business way of doing things. And I definitely wouldn't have been able to start a business and run a business and look after the insurances for the business and all of that kind of, unless I'd had the last decade and a bit of a career in a separate area. And I think that would probably be the best advice I could give to a new game developer, is try to get some experience elsewhere. Even if it's not the most thrilling job in the world, getting some experience in a different part of the world has absolutely helped my work ethic. It's absolutely helped my financial situation, because I don't have to worry about where the food is going to come from. And that enables me to focus a lot more on making sure the game is a good quality, rather than going, I have to release it, and I have to release it now because I need the money, or I don't have to tie myself up to somebody who's going to fund the game but is going to be particularly demanding about how it works. So I think the best advice I could give is, if you are brand new and fresh out of whatever education you've had, do indie gaming as a part-time project, but try and go and develop a career and get some experience elsewhere first, and get some financial security as well, because it will help you for your own peace of mind. I suppose the only other thing I should say as well is I'm married, and my wife is the most ridiculously tolerant and supportive person that you could possibly imagine. And despite all of the crazy ideas I have about making games, she doesn't hesitate for a single moment in terms of supporting me in doing that, and in supporting me in looking after not only her own career, but around the house and this kind of stuff. So if you could meet somebody who is that loving and that supportive as well, that would be a great piece of advice too.
What do you feel is success for an indie game developer?
I think that's going to vary depending on the developer, depending on the studio. I mean, for some people, there are these really good 3-4-man teams out there which are still, they're indie game developers, but they have remortgaged their house to fund the game or something like that. For them, success is going to mean sales. It's going to mean making sure that people see the game, buy the game, and it puts food on the table for them. It kind of goes a little bit back to the business thing I touched on before. For me, to be honest, I just want to see people having fun with it. That's what's been the development from the beginning. Now, put a hell of a lot of hours into this game, so we don't want to give it away for free. But at the same time, the whole principle of the game has been right from day one. Oh, look, those people are having fun whilst playing this random game. There is something to these mechanics. And I'd like to just see that. So as soon as I get that first purchase of the game on Steam, and it would be lovely if someone would leave a good review as well, that for me is kind of going to be success, because I'll know that there are people out there enjoying it. Providing they don't turn it on, play for 2 minutes, and then turn it back off again. That says to me that we got it right and that it was worth all the effort that has been put into it. And just being able to, for me, add it to the beginning of the portfolio for the company Whitway Studios, because there's a lot of stuff we want to do in VR. There are a lot of crazy worlds we want to create. And having this first game on the list, for me, that's success.
To make other developers learn, what resources would you recommend?
I think that it sounds really silly, but the best resource is just Google. The amount of problems that you can solve, or the amount of skills you can learn by just typing "how can I" or "how do I." And even if I look way back at the beginning of this game creation journey for me, I think the very first thing I must have Googled was how to make a game, in 2018, because it's changed dramatically from when I last worked on programming and that kind of stuff. And I mean, when it comes to the actual core game development, just about every problem that you will encounter as a developer, someone else has already encountered it, and they've posted the answer in a Unity forum or in another programming forum, and you can probably find the answer. If you've got an error code, even better, because Google will usually take you straight to whatever that problem was. And then the other sort of small percentage of problems that no one else has encountered, as a rule of thumb, if you can't find the answer to it on the internet, it's probably you've done something wrong and you've done something silly, or you don't know something fundamental and you've kind of got to go back to basics on what that is. But the internet is such an amazing tool, and whether it's YouTube or the Udemy courses that we always get advertised to us, or whether it's the Unity courses themselves. Unity do some amazing education out there, and they really want to encourage you to make great games using their games engine. And I can't fault the support you get from them and the Unity community enough. So yeah, the resources that are out there are literally a Google away. I have a colleague who I work with, and there's an ongoing joke when people come to his desk with an IT problem, because he looks after a lot of the IT. And the answer that he should give out, although he doesn't because he's far too polite, is "Let me Google that for you." And when it comes to support for developers, honestly, Google is your friend. It usually has the answer to most problems, or it will link you to a course that will teach you everything you need to know.
What do you think about the current marketing strategies in the indie game industry?
So, as I know you're a marketing expert, I will ask you to stop me if I say anything wrong. But I, for sure, am not a marketing expert, certainly not in the indie game industry anyway. And from what we've got some traction doing is working on social media. It's been really great to get out and actually, not physically talking or meeting these people in many cases, but talking to people who are interested in your game, your type of game. Especially if you could speak to some of the really, I'm talking from a VR point of view because that's what I know, but certainly the VR gaming community are absolutely fantastic. There are some really great people who are really encouraging. They really want to try your game, really want to give you feedback, really want to share it. They will share everything that you share on Twitter and Instagram and various social medias and that kind of thing. So if you, in general, are going to be a half-decent person and a half-decent human being, you can attract some interest in your game, and you can get people to share it that way. That certainly has been the approach we've taken. All that said, I think marketing is the one thing that we could do better for People Cubed, to be absolutely honest. I've said from the very beginning of creating this game, I'm 100% confident that the finished product will be a great game. It will be really enjoyable. It will make people laugh and people will have fun. The one weak point that I think I've got is I don't know the marketing world, especially in gaming and especially in indie gaming. So it's an area that, touching on the answer to one of your first questions, I still am looking for feedback on. I still am looking for constructive criticism on it. But from what I can see, I think it's social media. I mean, I'd be interested to hear what you think about it, to be honest.
Well, I think the current marketing strategies could be better. Because a lot of developers make a lot of mistakes, like they're pushing the release date forward. Just try to have your game finished before you set a date to release. You want your game to be pretty much ready to go on Steam about 3 months before you actually release it. So you have 3 months of time to market the game in the way it already is, and only fix like small things after you've started the that's heavy marketing period. You start the marketing before that period, but that period would be dedicated to almost only marketing. And that's a thing that a lot of developers don't do. And you can go with like a PR company or hire someone like me. And if you don't have the money to do that, then it will be the easiest for a developer to just go to a publisher, get the right contract. There are a lot of good publishers out there, and there is always one publisher that would like your game and has the same visions as you have. And they can help you because they can hire a PR company for you, and they can hire a marketing person, or they have that in their house. And then it solves the problem of not being able to afford a marketing person, because the publisher will pay that for you. And you might think that you will lose money from it, but you won't, since you're getting more sales out of that. And that's the thing that a lot of indie game developers aren't really doing that well.
Yeah, I think it sounds a little bit like what I was saying earlier. Treating it like a business as opposed to treating it like an art product, and making sure that you've covered the network, you've covered your marketing bases and that kind of thing. But yeah, thank you for answering the question you gave me. I really appreciate that.
Well, it's mostly like if you're trying to sell a pair of shoes, and this pair of shoes you are trying to sell is blue, they are not going to try to sell it to people that like brown shoes, because they will not be interested in your blue shoes. But if you find an audience that will fit your blue shoes and like wearing blue shoes, then you can get them to buy your blue shoes if you find them. So your goal will be to find the people that like blue shoes, and to make them like, hey, I have the best blue shoes, you have to wear mine. And that's the same with video games. If you make a game where there's a lot of zombies, well, there's a lot of zombie games, but there's also a lot of people that like them, and well, that's probably the easiest kind of game to promote, since a lot of people like them. But there's also games where the audience is smaller, like yours, VR games. Most people simply don't have a VR headset, and you know that. You knew that before you started development.
Absolutely.
And the marketing for that will be a bit harder. On the other side of that is that a lot of VR people are in groups, so you can just go into the group and like, hey, you guys all have a VR headset, and I'm gonna promote my game to you guys because I'm in the same group as you now. So you join Discord groups and everything, and that's also marketing. But that kind of stuff, talking to a lot of people, takes a lot of time, and that's a thing that a lot of indie game developers are lacking on.
Yeah, it does take a lot of time, but it also can be quite enjoyable. And I met in a group and through a mutual introduction. And I've spent time talking to other people and doing interviews and that kind of thing through people I've met in Discord and through social media. And like I say, especially I can only speak for VR, to be honest, but especially in the VR community, people are really keen to hear about what you've got, especially if you've got something a bit unique. And yeah, it's quite enjoyable to talk to people about the product you're making, and also what they're working on and what they're interested in and what they're playing or streaming. And it can be fun to do a lot of that kind of stuff too.
Yeah, it's mainly just putting in a lot of time, and if you don't want to put in the time, hire someone to do it for you. That's basically it.
Yeah. Okay.
We will go on to the next question now. Where do you see the indie game market going in a few years?
Again, I can only speak really to the VR market, because although I play indie games, I think the VR market is obviously where I know a bit more about the forecasting, and I know a bit more about where we're planning on going with it. And I think for indie games in VR at the moment, it's like an open market. It's a great opportunity. It's a much smaller market. Don't get me wrong. You're probably maximally looking at a pool of 7 million possible units that you could sell, which is tiny compared to the total number of game playing capable PCs. But at the same time, there's a lot of opportunity to grow within VR because you've not got the big guys coming in and getting involved. So Electronic Arts aren't about to release Star Wars Battlefront in VR. No one is about to release Black Ops 4 or 5 in VR. No one is going to come and do that and kind of take the rug from underneath all the indie developers' feet because it's not a big enough market yet for the big boys to actually play in. And that creates a little bit of a Wild West feeling, actually, to the indie VR game because people are kind of making the rules up as they go along with it. And they're sort of saying, okay, well, indie games traditionally focus on gameplay. They don't focus on having the best graphical assets and they don't focus on having the best lighting effects. But actually that's okay because most VR headsets and computers that are running that probably aren't capable of running the best graphical assets and the best special effects. So it sits kind of nicely there. And at the same time, what the VR market is needing is really good quality, long-playing games, which is what we've tried to focus on doing here. We're not producing a game that's going to blow you away in terms of graphics, and we've had to really cut back on even stuff like the special effects because once you start playing with some of these game engines, you can get really, and I'm definitely guilty of this, really distracted by, oh, that's shiny, I'm going to do this, and oh, that's shiny, I'm going to do that. And then you realize that actually that doesn't work in virtual reality, so you need to cut it back and make it a bit more basic, especially when you've got one eye on the standalone VR headsets as well. So when it comes to the VR indie market, I think there's a huge opportunity there. And whilst a lot of people are quite critical that you read in the kind of the mainstream gaming media of VR and saying, oh, it's going to fail, it's already failed, oh no, it's not going well. If you look at the numbers that are truly involved in it and you look at the evolution of the market, that's kind of not what the data shows. And it's a great opportunity for people to come in and hopefully make a name for themselves at this early stage of the market, in a similar way that some of the big gaming companies made their name for themselves in the early days of gaming. And you never know, in 20 years' time, maybe your company will be the next Electronic Arts or whoever it is because you got into the VR gaming when everyone else was saying, no, not interesting. So I think for indie gaming developers, indie developers, I should say, there is a great opportunity in VR right now. And I mean, I'd encourage everybody to give it a go, and try it.
You said there are no VR games like Star Wars Battlefront. Did you know that there is a Star Wars Battlefront for PlayStation VR?
Well, there's a version there's a sample demo type. It's not a full-on game, so you're not going in there and getting the full game in PlayStation VR. And you find that with an awful lot of games is there'll be a version of it. And I mean, to be honest, PlayStation VR is where a lot of really good titles have been put into VR. So, for example, Wipeout. I don't know if you remember Wipeout at all from...
Yeah, I have played Wipeout on my PlayStation 4.
Yeah, Wipeout is now in VR, and from what I understand, that's an absolutely fantastic game. And to be clear, there are... Ubisoft does have a few games in VR as well. Like there's a Star Trek, is it Bridge Commander, or it's what that type of game, and that's unarguably a big studio stepping in and having a go in VR. Obviously, we've got there's a Doom game that is exclusively VR, and we've converted things like Fallout 4 into VR as well. So there are some big titles, and there is some interest and an increasing amount of interest. But I think perhaps the Star Wars thing is a bad example, but definitely you're not looking at the Call of Duty 4 is Black Ops 4 is not about to be released in VR, and you're unlikely to get a Tomb Raider game in VR next 4 or 5 years. And whilst I'm not suggesting that an indie dev goes out and creates a Tomb Raider in VR or tries to, or a Black Ops game, there's definitely room in there that isn't being taken up by people that would be playing these bigger games in trying not to say flat gaming, but that kind of the traditional gaming.
Where do you see the indie game market going in a few years?
Like I say, for VR, I think that it's going to get a lot bigger, and I think that there's a big opportunity there for indie gamers. I think that's more or less said to the previous question, to be honest.
Which other indie game developers, if any, offered you any support or knowledge in creating the game?
I wouldn't be able to name any specific people or studios, but I kind of point back at what I mentioned earlier, and that is if you look on forums, if you look on, or for example, even Steam developer forums, there's a huge indie game development community out there that are willing to answer even the most stupid of questions, because at some point they've asked those stupid questions as well. And it's great to be able to go online and say, describe, this is the problem I'm having. Has anyone experienced anything like this? And then usually, as I said earlier, 90% of the time, someone has experienced that problem, or they can at least point you in the direction of what's going on. So, yeah, the indie developers generally, in my experience, do seem to support each other, which is a really fun part of working in it.
Is there an AAA studio you would work for if you could?
So when I was a kid and when I first learned a bit of computer game development, bearing in mind this is back in the days before the internet was a big thing and that kind of stuff, I think the guys who I used to dream about working for and I would have loved to have been involved in their games is probably Rare in the UK. I was absolutely obsessed with games like GoldenEye, Banjo-Kazooie, and that kind of game from that studio. And I know they've been taken over by Microsoft and things have changed slightly for them in the last 10 or so years. But there's always going to be a special place in my heart for the amount of hours that they helped me waste as a child.
Which game, indie or AAA, do you wish you had worked on?
I think there's probably a couple of different answers to it. So, in terms of what I play day to day, what I would play if I wasn't working on making people cubed, I enjoy quite a lot of strategy games. So I would love to have been involved in something like a Civilization game, or maybe something like a Crusader Kings or Europa Universalis 4 or something like that, because I really would love to see the mechanics behind it and the mathematics and all the stuff that most people would probably consider to be quite boring. And I'd love to see how the true balancing is done in a strategy game. However, all that said, one of the most amazing games that I've enjoyed over my lifetime, going back to what I said earlier about the studio Rare, was Conker's Bad Fur Day, which I mentioned earlier on as well. And that game being fit into that console, the N64, is, the more I understand about games development, the more amazing achievement I feel that was. Because that console was so underpowered compared to what they managed to achieve on that game. And now, being a kid who was barely able to do a paper round at the time that game came out, I was blown away by that back then. But now, as someone with a bit of games development knowledge and somebody who can look a little bit at how games used to be developed for a console like that, and have a bit, not a big, but a bit of a deeper understanding into it, it just blows me away all the more as to just how skilled the people were that worked on that game. And I would love to have been involved in that.
Have you ever worked for other gaming companies?
No, I've not worked for any other gaming companies. I've just dreamt of working, as I mentioned.
Are you okay?
Yes, sorry, did you not get the answer?
No.
No worries. Your question, did I ever work for any other gaming? And the answer is no. I've not worked.
Okay. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Bristol in the UK, over on the west side of the UK. Although I only lived there till I was 18, and since then my career has taken me all kinds of different places, mostly living in the UK, but working in different places around the world as well. So whilst I grew up in Bristol, I don't think I actually grew up until I started working after I left my hometown.
What were your childhood interests?
As you probably can tell from some of the answers I gave earlier on, gaming, definite interest. Spending far too much time on like the N64 and the GameCube, and well, the ZX Spectrum and the SNES and that kind of thing. So that was probably a big interest of mine as a kid. I used to enjoy playing around outside in the woods and various things with friends of mine as a kid. But yeah, probably far too much time spent playing computer games.
Did you have any gaming education at school, or did you learn the whole development process on your own?
I learnt it through various courses on the internet, and I mean it's an interesting how the world's changing, just in terms of education in general, because you get the choice of going and spending £10,000 a year on a university course, and you could probably go to an online course and not get a certificate at the end of it, but you probably get just as good an education. And I think game creation, programming, graphic design, the tools that are available online now are absolutely fantastic. And for me, that was the route to take. It was definitely the more cost-effective, time-effective, and just it was able to fit in with my existing career. So that was the direction I took.
What is your favorite video game of all time?
So I've mentioned quite a few games already that I fell in love with and spent too much time on, like the Civilization series, good game I mentioned already. Other games by Rare, like Perfect Dark and things like that. But probably the one, I'm going to cheat a bit because I'm not going to say a single game, but I'm going to say a game series. Probably the game series that I, single-handedly loved the most was the Mass Effect trilogy. I absolutely adored those games. They were second to none in my head, and I can't even put my finger on why I liked them so much better than other similar games, except for the story. I just completely fell in love with, and I think to this day it's probably the only game that's ever actually made me cry because of the nature of the storyline, and I'm not ashamed to admit that. I'd love for my game studio one day to create a game in virtual reality that gives you the same emotional, visceral reaction to the storyline that one does. My ambition, although I probably will regret saying this, is to make someone break their warranty by crying inside a VR headset. And certainly that Mass Effect game series, that did it for me. Playing those 3 games, they were good.
And what is your favorite video game of this year, and why?
Now my answer to this is going to be a bit rubbish because I've spent most of the last year making, and I think saying that People Cubed is my favorite game this year would not be very fair. So I think the thing I've been able to spend the last 12 months playing the most, again, very sad answer, but there's a free-to-play game in VR called Rec Room. And it's a very social game. It's a very friendly game. It's one where you can do a huge amount of different things in virtual reality. You can be paintballing, you can be laser shooting, you can be playing golf or football or various other stuff. And because it's all in virtual reality, because it's all very social, I actually think it's a really good game, although I'm sure a lot of people will tell me I'm silly for that. So that's probably the game that I spent the most time playing, even though I'm sure it's definitely not the best VR game that is out. It's just the one I've got access to and is quickest and easiest for me to jump into. So I apologize to anyone listening to this that disagrees with me, but I do love that game.
Okay, that was the final question I had. Is there other stuff you want to say?
No, I think the only other thing I would say is I'd encourage to look for People Cubed on the internet or follow us on our social media. That's Whitway Studios on the social media. And I think you're going to put that in the link to the video.
Yeah, all the links to your studio and your social media will all be put in the description below. Okay,
so yeah, just encourage people to come and talk to us, and to remember for the 2nd of November that People Cubed will be coming out in VR.